y'all. So we are continuing our series going through the ancient Hebrew poem known as Psalm 1. Now, this episode is really closely tied to our last episode, so if you haven't heard that, I do recommend going and listening to it first. I won't be really recapping a lot of what we covered. I'll just do a brief recap as a reminder, just so we're all on the same page. But if you want the full explanation, then definitely I recommend going back. All right, so let's get into it. So the big picture of what we're doing here is we're going through this poem, again, popularly known as Psalm 1, as it is in the Not a Bible translation, which is my own translation, and I'm explaining why I'm translating it in the way that I did, and we're talking about the meaning and specifically the moral teachings of the poem as we go. So far, we're just in the first couple lines of the poem. Cheers for the man who ain't done gone in the counsel of wrongdoers. And of course, in earlier episodes, we talked about cheers for the man who, and then in the last episode, we talked about the phrase ain't done gone. Why am I translating it as ain't done gone? So just as a quick recap on some of the specifics that we talked about last time, first, we looked at the word translated here as gone, and we saw that it's a Hebrew verb that is in a conjugation known as katal. Now, this conjugation encodes something called aspect, which is a linguistic category, kind of like tense is, but it's not tense. So usually people think of verbs, at least in modern English, usually we think of verbs in terms of tense, which is about relating events to other events in time. Aspect, though, isn't about relating one event or action to another, or one moment to another. It's about the temporal characteristics of a single event or action. So there are two main types of aspect. There's perfective aspect, which describes an event as a whole without paying attention to its internal changes. And then there's imperfective aspect, which does pay attention to the internal changes within an action. So this katal form is perfective. It's the perfective aspect. Okay, so that's kind of the Hebrew side of the equation. But then we also talked about the English side of the equation. So mainstream varieties of English actually don't have verbs that encode aspect. However, some non-standard varieties do. And specifically, we talked about a grammatical form known as the preverbal done, which is found in Southern American English, African American English, and several other varieties. So this preverbal done or perfective done, this is expressed by putting the word done immediately prior to a verb. For example, he done ran away, or he done walked, or whatever. You could really put the word done before pretty much any verb, and it would express this perfective aspect. So we looked at a number of facts last time that have led me to translate the Hebrew katal form using this preverbal done. And since the word ain't is typically used to negate the preverbal done in present tense contexts, that's how we get ain't done gone. So cheers for the man who ain't done gone in the counsel of wrongdoers. We also talked about the expression to go in the counsel and how it's very similar to the expression to follow advice in contemporary English. And this actually makes it clear that the passage is talking about the person's actual behavior, not about what they like or what they are a fan of or what they profess to believe. So that leads us to the main topic that we're going to be talking about in this episode, and that is the phrase, the counsel of wrongdoers. So the word counsel here is not really an unusual translation for this Hebrew word. The word basically means counsel or advice. The reason why I'm translating it counsel rather than advice simply has to do with the variety of words that all share this same root. So, for example, in English, the word counsel has a word that relates to it that shares its root, and that is the word consult. Well, in Hebrew, there are two variations of this word, one of which means counsel and one of which means consult, whereas the word advise or advice doesn't really have a variation that means the same thing as consult. So in order to maintain consistency across instances and variations of words that share this root, counsel is really the only option that means the same thing and that has all the variations necessary. Okay, so the next main word here is the word wrongdoers. And this is really the substance of what I want to talk to you about today. So traditionally, this word is translated as the wicked. And while that's not a terrible translation or anything, there are a few problems with it that actually have real implications for how we understand these passages. So on kind of the more technical side, this Hebrew word has several different forms. Sometimes it is definite, sometimes it is indefinite, sometimes it is singular, sometimes it is plural. Well, when this is translated simply as the wicked, translators aren't able to make those distinctions because you can't just say a wicked or wicked and have it refer to people who are wicked. You'd have to say the wicked. So in other words, it doesn't allow you to have it definite or indefinite corresponding to the Hebrew. And likewise, usually people wouldn't say something like the wickeds. Maybe you would say the wicked ones. But very often people just translate it as the wicked because the word does not naturally lend itself to taking definite and indefinite forms, singular and plural forms. Whereas wrongdoers does, right? You can have a wrongdoer, the wrongdoer. You can have wrongdoers or the wrongdoers. You know, it can take a definite and indefinite, plural and singular, no problem. So on that aspect alone, it is better able to reflect the various nuances of the Hebrew. But that's kind of, again, on the technical side of things. A more serious problem, though, has to do with how people tend to understand these words. So the word wicked actually has a lot of theological baggage tied to it. And when people read these texts with that word, they often, even unknowingly, import all that theology into the text and read it as though that's what the text is expressing, when it really isn't what the text is expressing. So to explain this more fully, many Christians understand the righteous and the wicked in the following way. The righteous are those who have been justified or declared righteous by God. And the wicked are understood to be those who are under God's condemnation, which is very often understood to be everyone else. That is, everyone who hasn't been justified. And depending on which Christian tradition you're looking at, that may include literally all of humanity, like every infant from the day they are born or from the time they are conceived even, because of the doctrine of original sin. So since everyone is typically understood to be condemned from the get-go, then becoming justified, becoming part of the class the righteous, has to be achieved in some way. And again, the typical Christian doctrine is that it is attained through faith in Jesus, that is, by accepting his death as a substitute for the punishment that is due to sinners. And when someone does that, God declares the individual as righteous, which means that they are no longer under condemnation, even if they sin along the way, and it is expected that they will. But Jesus' life stands in place of the life of the sinner in the eyes of God. Okay, so obviously these are subjects that there are many, many different nuances of what different Christians have thought over time. There are debates between Protestants and Catholics. But generally speaking, though, the debates have often revolved around the means by which someone might be justified. But there's still a general view that someone who is justified, someone who is part of the class, the righteous, is righteous before God, even though they might still sin in their daily life. Okay, so let's just go through a few equivalents to try and make these categories straight. So the righteous in this view, again, this is just the standard sorts of views that you might find in Christianity that inform how people understand terms like the righteous and the wicked. So the righteous equals true believers, while the wicked equals all who aren't true believers. The righteous equals those declared just before God, while the wicked equals those who stand condemned before God. The righteous equals those bound for heaven, while the wicked equals those bound for hell. Okay, so hopefully that helps to kind of sort out those categories. Again, the wicked here, since we're focused on the translation of this term that is usually translated the wicked, but which I'm translating as wrongdoers, the wicked here are viewed as those who are bound for hell, those who are not true believers, those who are condemned before God. That is very often what Christian readers have come to their mind when they're reading biblical texts and they come across the word the wicked. So primarily for many, many Christians, the terms the righteous and the wicked are not primarily ethical or behavioral categories, but theological categories. And where this really kind of hits home is that most Christians reading the Bible, coming across the term the wicked, would not count themselves as among that class, even though they would admit that they occasionally or even frequently do things that are wrong. They engage in wrongdoing. Okay, so this is why this is important, right? Because when we are reading this passage, here in this poem, Psalm 1, or any other passage, and we come across this word, how we translate it may impact whether we view ourselves as someone aptly described by that term or not. So when we're looking at this for not just historical interest, not just wanting to know, what did this ancient author have to say? But when we're reading these texts, trying to understand principles and trying to understand morality and to actually improve our own selves and hopefully understand truth and do what is right, it can be really important to have terms that communicate to us in a way that helps us to learn those lessons. And regardless of who you are and what you believe, whether you're religious or not, or Christian or Jewish or Muslim or some other thing, I hope that your interest in these texts and in listening to this podcast is beyond just historical interest, even though history is really, really important. But history has lessons in it. It has things that we can gain for our present benefit. And really, I mean, isn't it always a good idea to try to understand truth and to try to bring ourselves to actually think by and act by genuine moral principles? I certainly think that that's important, and I hope you do too. So again, understanding the terms here is really essential because the terms that we use can make a really big difference as to how we understand what the poem is saying and how we understand how we might relate to it. So the fact of the matter is that this Hebrew term actually does not refer to this Christian theological category of the wicked. Instead, it actually is an ethical or behavioral term. It simply means one who does wrong. And likewise, the contrasting term in Hebrew means right doers, people who do what is right. So both of these terms have to do with someone's moral behavior. Neither of them refer to the much later developed theological categories that are so popular within Christianity. So again, if we want to understand these writings for what they really meant in the ancient world, it's important to not translate them in a way that uses terms that we today understand quite differently. Now, the terms the righteous and the wicked, in and of themselves, they could be used, and people do use them at times, to just refer to behavioral, ethical, moral categories. And so, in that sense, it's not like they're wrong. However, it is the case that many, many readers do actually bring these Christian theological categories to their reading of these texts. And again, I know I've already said this, but just to really drive it home, when you're reading a text and you read the wicked, blah, 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 I mean, you're probably not going to count yourself in that, right? But if you read wrongdoer, you might think, do I do wrong? And you might actually say yes, right? So the purpose of a poem like Cheers for the Man, Psalm 1, is actually to give moral instruction. And if someone doesn't see themselves as being part of a certain category or whatever, they might think that that particular aspect of moral instruction doesn't apply to them when it actually might. So knowing how the categories operate is really important. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's just take a little bit of a broader look at what we've covered so far. Cheers for the man who ain't done gone in the counsel of wrongdoers. Okay, so we can see that it is expressing a positive attitude toward a person who meets these certain qualifications, right? A person who is aptly described by what follows. And the way this person is described is that they ain't done gone in the counsel of wrongdoers. Now, as we discussed last time, because the verb is expressing perfective aspect rather than past tense or perfect tense, this actually is not denying that the person did wrong in their past, right? It's just saying that they, even if they did go in a wrong way in their past, they didn't stay there. Their past action of doing wrong was dynamic and changing, and they left that way. In other words, it was imperfective, to use the appropriate grammatical aspect, but they didn't perfectively or in a one single unchanging action go in the way of wrongdoers. That would imply that they went there and stayed there, that they continued in the counsel of wrongdoers. And of course, this is confirmed even more by the fact that the next line says, and in the way of errorists ain't done stayed. So in Hebrew, these are parallel poetic lines that express the same general idea in different ways with slightly different nuances. But here in that next line, it's really overtly expressing staying in the way of errorists. So staying in the way of errorists and being done gone in the counsel of wrongdoers are expressing generally the same sort of idea. Again, different nuances, same basic picture. And again, to go in a certain counsel means the same thing as to follow advice. So it's talking about actually conducting one's actions in a particular way. So the way you go, and the Hebrew verb here is halach, the way you go is the way you behave. And this was developed in later Judaism with a notion halakha, which in Rabbinic Judaism is all the various stipulations and rulings and decisions as to the right way of following the Torah. But more basically, it just has to do with how someone behaves, which is how it's used here. So since going in the counsel of wrongdoers is paralleled with staying in the way of errorists, it's clear that really to go in the counsel of wrongdoers is to do wrongdoing. So the implication here is that the counsel that wrongdoers will give will be counsel that will also lead to wrongdoing. People often tend to advise others to go about things in a way that's similar to how they are going about things, at least in principle. So when someone hears or reads this first part of the poem, the impact that it is supposed to have on the hearer is that we're supposed to think, oh wait, cheers? Cheers for someone? Oh yeah, we all want to have cheers be for us. We want to be cheer-worthy. And the first thing that's stated here as to what could qualify someone to be cheer-worthy is that they ain't done gone in the counsel of wrongdoers. And so that is supposed to have the effect of every person self-examining and really questioning and evaluating whether they are going in the counsel of wrongdoers. And if they are, if they want the cheers, well, make sure to cease going in the counsel of wrongdoers. So that even if you had gone in the counsel of wrongdoers, it won't be true that you're done gone in the counsel of wrongdoers. Another thing I'll just mention here in closing that we'll talk about more in future episodes is that the counsel of wrongdoers is contrasted here in the poem with the direction of he who does his thing. So he who does his thing is how I'm rendering the term Yahweh, which is the name of the God of Israel, and I'll talk about that more in future episodes. So he who does his thing, Yahweh, in this poem, has directions for people to follow. And those who follow the counsel of wrongdoers are themselves wrongdoers. Those who follow the direction of he who does his thing actually become right doers. And at the very end of the poem, it refers to Yahweh as a knower of the way of right doers. And in the context of the whole poem, the reason why it's pointing to he who does this thing as a knower of the way of right doers isn't about just telling us something about the internal mental awareness of Yahweh. It's not about satisfying curiosity about what goes on in the mind of God, like, oh, he knows this way of right doers. No, instead, Yahweh knows the way of right doers like a local person knows the way to the nearest gas station. In other words, like if you say, oh, how do we get to the gas station? Oh, ask Jill, she knows. Well, you point out that Jill knows the way to the gas station so that people know that that's where they can go to get the information. So pointing out that he who does this thing, Yahweh, is a knower of the way of right doers, it's pointing that out for the purpose of saying, hey, if you want to be someone who does right doing, go to he who does this thing, go to Yahweh, because he, a knower of the way of right doers. He is where you can go to get the information that you need to walk in the way of right doers. So all this is to say that this poem is greatly concerned about practical moral behavior. And ultimately, it urges its readers and hearers to forsake all wrongdoing and to embrace consistent right doing. And it gives instruction regarding the means by which someone can do just that. So, as I've said in previous episodes, this poem really does have a lot that's worth contemplating. And the more we contemplate these sorts of ideas, the more we can think about the sort of person that we want to be in the future. That is something that is really cool about being human, that we can really imagine future possible versions of ourselves. And we can actually expose ourselves to information that can really benefit us and that can call us to transform our characters to be genuinely moral. So I hope you benefited from this, and I hope that you'll have the words of the psalm kind of ringing in your ear. Cheers for the man who ain't done gone in the counsel of wrongdoers. And I also hope that you will join me again for future episodes, and we'll talk about this poem and much more besides. And on that note, if you're not actually following the podcast yet within a podcast app, I definitely recommend doing so. It's actually just one of the great convenient things about podcasts that when you click follow in a podcast app, it actually downloads each new episode to your device whenever they come out. And obviously that's just nice and convenient. It's more consistent and reliable than YouTube notifications or Facebook notifications. So yeah, if you're listening to this on the website, for example, within the podcast player, there will just be a button that says follow. You can click that and then click whichever podcast app that you might have on your phone. And that's just an easy way to follow. There will also be a link in the description to a blog post that I made that gives several different options for following the podcast. And if you actually are listening to this right now using a podcast app, I just want to mention that I recently put podcast players on our website, bdsda.com. And if you just go to bdsda.com on the homepage and scroll down below the banner with the pictures, you'll see that there's a podcast player for all the episodes of the Trent Wilde blog, and also for another podcast called Sabbath School with Branch Davidians. They come out with new content every week, and it's really, really good. If you're liking what you're hearing here, I definitely think you should check out that podcast as well. All right, that said, thank you so much for listening, and farewell till next time.